Hi everybody, this is Daniel Allen. I am an urban forester for the Utah DNR, and I'm pleased to discuss proper pruning today. Now, before you prune, it's important to understand a few things. First off, it is important to take pruning seriously because there is a potential to cause lasting damage or even bring about the death of the tree. It's also good to have a basic understanding of the tree's biology and how it will respond. Don't worry, we'll discuss this more in a moment. Keep in mind that when you remove limbs, you are not only taking away energy stored in the wood, but you are taking away potential energy that would otherwise be produced by the leaves you take. And regardless of how expert we are, the fact remains that pruning wounds the tree and opens it to potential infection. This makes it a good idea to know your objective, such as clearance, thinning, structure, aesthetics, and so forth. It helps to visualize what you want the tree to look like when you're done. Take several breaks, especially when you are new to pruning, to take a step back and evaluate your progress toward your chosen objective. You will want to use clean and sharp tools, like this handsaw. It is also advisable to seek quality tools. Make sure that any loppers you get are bypass loppers, meaning the blade passes beyond the stopper in a scissor-like motion, scissor-like motion kind of like this, as opposed to anvil pruners, which stop the blade on a flat surface and can cause undue crushing and tearing. One more thing, I like to make sure I wear my safety glasses because nothing is quite as bad as getting poked in the eye with a branch. In speaking of a tree's biological response to pruning, few concepts are as important as branch attachment. But first, some important terminology. When I speak of a parent limb or a central leader, I'm usually speaking of the primary stem from which lateral branches originate. It might be helpful to think of this as the main trunk. The term lateral branch is self-explanatory. It always refers to a branching side limb that started out on a bud on a previously formed stem. Union, or crotch, is where a lateral branch and parent stem meet. A final term that is useful in our discussion is the term dominance. Trees are actually a collection of semi-autonomous organelles. This means each limb strives to grow as if it were its own independent tree. Dominance, then, is used to express the way in which a tree limb strives to outcompete its neighbors by growing bigger, higher, and faster than them. Ideally, only the central leader gets to keep the overall dominance of the tree. Taking it one step further, a primary scaffold limb branching from the trunk gets to keep the overall dominance of that major limb, and so on. If done right, we get a tree with classic excurrent form and uniform bifurcation. We can get an idea of the ideal pattern by looking at the leaf veination on this beech leaf. As lateral branches grow and are kept small relative to their parent limb, they form a special structure at their union called a branch collar. Many times, this structure can be seen as a swollen area at the base of a lateral branch. The collar contains special dormant cells and chemicals known as the branch protection zone, which stands ready to respond to a potential limb loss. Maintaining the branch collar is critical to encouraging quick wound compartmentalization and decay resistance. Compartmentalization in trees is analogous to wound healing in humans. On the other hand, when a lateral branch is allowed to grow large in relation to its parent, the result is what we call codominant stems. Codominant stems lack the strength of a branch collar, and they often develop bark inclusion, which is like sandwiching bark between the stems. This inclusion further weakens the union and makes them much more prone to failure. This is why, as we prune, we strive to keep our laterals less than 1/2 the diameter of their parent and less than 1/3 the height of the entire tree. It is also important to select and encourage lateral branch angles that are between 45 and 90 degrees to the parent stem. In general, we want to avoid narrow V crotches and encourage more open U-shaped ones. This picture does a good job illustrating what a branch collar looks like. Another helpful indicator is the branch bark ridge, which is rarely absent from a healthy union. The formation of the branch collar and the branch bark ridge is the desired outcome and, again, occurs when laterals are kept small relative to their parent. These structures occur as both the parent limb and the lateral branch grow larger in diameter each year. A healthy union is able to eject and exfoliate the excess bark at the point of attachment, like that. But a codominant stem will direct this bark inward and sandwich it between the two limbs, thus weakening them. So when we actually prune a limb, it is very important to locate our final cut just outside the branch collar, as the dashed line illustrates. Now sometimes the branch collar is not visible because the limbs are too small, or the species just doesn't show it well. In this case, we locate the branch bark ridge and draw an imaginary line that extends from the already present ridge line. From this imaginary line, we will make our cut approximately 45 degrees out, which is usually approximately perpendicular to the branch that we are removing. There are two main types of cuts that are relevant to the home arborist. The first is called a thinning cut. It's when we remove an entire branch back to its point of origin. This cut is usually employed when branches have some kind of serious defect, such as being too crowded, growing in the wrong direction, or having a wound that is not likely to heal. The second type of cut is a reduction cut. We utilize this cut when we want to keep a limb, but it is to our advantage to reduce it in length. With a reduction cut, we reduce the length of a branch by cutting it back to a lateral branch. Since this type of cut has a limited ability to compartmentalize, it is best kept as smaller cuts early in the life of the limb. The rule with reduction cuts is that the lateral we cut back to must be at least 1/3 the diameter of its parent, so that it can subsequently assume the role of the parent as the dominant leader for the branch. As for heading cuts, we'll speak about this third type of cut in a moment. You'll probably notice right off that these cuts have 3 components to them. All saw cuts should employ this 3-part cut, so as to avoid causing the bark to tear as the pruned limb falls away. Tearing creates an excessively large and ugly wound, which makes the tree more vulnerable to infection and is more difficult for the tree to compartmentalize. The only possible exception here is with limbs that are smaller than 1 inch in diameter, or limbs that you can hold and exert total control over their fall. So we begin by making an undercut, or a notch, usually about 1/4 of the way into the limb to be removed. The trick is to keep your blade from being pinched. Next, we make our through cut, which passes all the way through the limb. In the case of a notch, the through cut is positioned directly behind it. But in the more common undercut, we will make our through cut a little further out on the limb. Cuts number 1 and 2 leave us with a stub, which we cut off with our third finishing cut. Ideally, a finished cut should be clean and smooth with no jagged edges or torn bark. Now here's where I get to stand on my personal soapbox for a moment. This third type of cut that can be made is called a heading cut, or a topping cut. This is the result of a reduction-like cut that is made back to a lateral that is too small and too weak to assume dominance. Or even worse, a heading cut is made in the space between lateral branches without regard to the health consequences. I'd like to make it perfectly clear that for a number of reasons, topping is extremely harmful to trees. Friends don't let friends top. First, topping usually takes more than 1/4 of the live crown, which results in a major loss of stored energy, which can starve the tree. 25% of the live branches is the definite upper limit to the amount of live material we can safely remove from the tree. It's what we call our pruning budget. Now keep in mind, however, that dead limbs are not included in this rule. Secondly, topping often causes a tree to go into shock and can induce burning of tissues that are not accustomed to full sunlight. Third, the large and hard-to-heal wounds that topping creates causes a tree to be highly susceptible to insects and diseases. Additionally, topping is usually done to reduce the size of the tree, but this effect is only temporary because it causes rapid and unhealthy growth of an excessive number of water sprouts. This new growth usually leads to an increased cost of maintenance, which is directly counter to the supposed money-saving benefit of topping. Keep in mind that a large tree is only unsafe if it has poor structure. Ironically, this flush of new growth is usually very poorly attached and is very prone to breakage, especially as it grows larger. So topping actually makes a tree more unsafe than it was. And lastly, as you can clearly see, a topped tree is just plain ugly. Now that we've discussed definitions, branch attachment, and proper cuts, we are ready to move into the realm of pruning objectives. Structural training is the first in our discussion because it is by far the most important pruning we can ever do for a tree. And as you'll see, it incorporates elements of all the other objectives. Structural training is the process of planning for and guiding a tree to its ideal health, strength, and beauty. Structural training is just like standard vehicle maintenance. If we do it regularly, we will avoid big costly issues down the line. Normally, we use training during the first few pruning intervals for young trees, when it can have the most positive effect. But working on structure is even relevant for older trees. So let's begin. The first step is to remove the 4 Ds. This is any dead, damaged, diseased, or deranged limbs. Now deranged here means any limb that is growing abnormally, such as a crossing limb or one that grows back into the trunk. Next, we want to decide on the existing and the desired structure of the tree. An excurrent tree has a single leader with all of the lateral limbs smaller and subordinate to it. For example, most conifer trees like pines and spruces exhibit a strong excurrent habit. I like to remember the term by thinking of excurrent trees like the sword Excalibur. The benefits of excurrent structure include very strong branch attachment, aesthetic appeal, and good limb taper. To understand taper in trees, just remember it is the same gradual slimming of diameter that gives a fishing pole its strength and flexibility. It does the same thing for trees. Now, decurrent trees, on the other hand, are like most willows, with several limbs arising from nearly the same point and striving for dominance. Even in naturally decurrent trees, we want to establish excurrent-like structure, even if this means we do so on more than one leader. Thus, in the second step of structural training, we pick our leader and subordinate any competing limbs through proper reduction or perhaps even removal cuts. Even in a young tree, we can often picture where our lowest permanent branch should be. This is usually at a given height. For instance, In a park strip, we may want 7 feet of clearance for pedestrians like me on the sidewalk. And on the other side, on the street side, we would maybe want 15 feet or more for vehicle clearance. Identifying these lowest limbs is what step 3 is all about, and it helps us to know that every branch below that point ought to be temporary, even if we do not plan to remove them at this time. In step 4, we want to identify and establish good scaffold or lateral limbs. Here, we want to strive to pick out limbs that will have good spacing, both vertically, up and down, and radially, side to side around the trunk. In trees that will grow large, we want our permanent scaffold limbs to have at least 18 inches of space between them. In smaller trees, we can drop that distance to 12 inches. The 5th and final step is to identify and subordinate the temporary branches below the lowest permanent branch and between our desired scaffold limbs. It is a good thing to leave these temporary branches because they help the tree make and store energy. But if a temporary limb is sizable, we will at least subordinate it with reduction cuts, and we might even consider, if we have room in our pruning budget, to remove it entirely. Over time, as we repeat the training process year after year, all temporary branches will end up being removed. This picture ought to help us visualize what structural training looks like. It may very well be that the limbs in the lower third of the tree will ultimately be removed, but for now, they have just been subordinated by reduction cuts. Just remember, in structural training or any other type of pruning, how we make cuts is much more important than what we cut. And temporary limbs mean we do not have to stress about solving all of the tree's problems at once. Now let's review our other pruning objectives. Crown cleaning is the routine maintenance that we usually reserve for older trees that have an established structure. It is removing all of the cluttered and dead limbs. Though some thinning is almost always a byproduct of the other pruning objectives, crown thinning is a specific technique that is used to open up the tree for light and air penetration. Or it might also be employed to reduce the end weight and wind drag. Crown raising is just what it sounds like. We concentrate our pruning in the lower canopy for the sake of clearance or view. On older trees that have not benefited from routine structural training, but nevertheless need to meet a certain clearance specification, we can often avoid making large and potentially harmful cuts by making several smaller cuts in the lower portion of the crown and creating a steep V shape on the underside of the canopy, rather than removing large limbs from the trunk all the way up to the specified height. Crown restoration is a technique employed by professional arborists to restore a tree that has been severely damaged or topped. It is the only general objective that sometimes necessitates the use of heading cuts. As we move into the principles of fruit tree pruning, don't let go of what we've discussed thus far, because all of those concepts still apply. First, we're going to discuss the generalities that can be applied at any time, and then we'll move into the specifics of training up a newly planted fruit tree. One of the main points to remember with fruit trees is that we want to keep their growth horizontal, because that is where the fruit is. Vertical growth is vigorously vegetative and bears little fruit. Fruit trees are also pruned more frequently. Ideally, we regularly prune 2 times per year, once in late winter, which means March, and once in early summer, meaning June. This is so because fruit-bearing trees tend to grow aggressively, and the moderate stress of pruning stimulates fruiting. What's more, frequent pruning is necessary to maintain tight control over the structure of a fruit tree in order to maximize light penetration, which leads to a larger yield of higher quality fruit. One exception we make in fruit tree pruning is heading cuts. because they can be utilized to break the vertical tendency and encourage lateral growth. But remember, heading cuts are only used on small young stems, which can better handle the abuse. When we do head trees, we cut back to a bud that is facing the direction of desired growth. As for structure in general, we train apples, pears, and nut trees to have a central leader, and we train peaches and other stone fruits to an open base shape. But for older trees, you are likely stuck with whatever structure it's been given. Many older apple trees, for instance, have been trained to a vase structure, and there is nothing to be done other than removing annual sprouts and encouraging horizontal growth. Here, we get a bit more specific for the process of training a newly planted fruit tree into the central leader form. If your tree is a whip, we'll begin with figure A. Planting of an unbranched whip needs to be done in the late winter. Then after a few weeks, once the buds begin to swell, we make a heading cut at about 30 inches. Now refer to figure B. In the summer of the first season, we prune again when the new growth is 3 to 4 inches long. You'll want to pick a single central leader from the sprouts just below your previous heading cut and remove the others that are growing close by it. And further down, select 4 to 5 evenly spaced laterals to become the first scaffold whorl and remove all the rest. In case you're wondering, a whorl is basically just a set of lateral branches that arise from the same or nearly the same level on the parent stem. Pine trees are a great example of naturally formed whorls. If the branches you have selected as scaffold limbs have narrow branch angles, you can use toothpicks, guy lines, or weights to widen those angles to about 60 degrees. This training hardware needs to be in place for about one growing season and should then be removed. A year after planting, in late winter, we again head the central leader. See figure C. This time, we want to make the cut about 30 inches above the highest branch of our previously established scaffold whorl. From here on out, we basically repeat step B, but now we just ignore everything below the highest established scaffold branch. Sometimes the nursery stock we plant already has its first scaffold formed, and it is called a feathered tree. If this is the case, we begin with this step. We again repeat the heading cut in late winter and the whorled structure cuts in early summer, and after 3 whorl forming cycles, we have a tree that looks like figure D. Voila! Now we have an ideally structured fruit tree. From this point on, we switch our pruning objective around to focus on structure and height reduction in March and water sprout removal in June. Lastly, creating an open base structure is accomplished by establishing one scaffold whorl as in figure A and B, but we do not remove the B and C laterals that grow beneath our heading cut, and thus do not create a central leader. From this point on, we manage each of the 4 or 5 limbs in the first whorl as if they were their own central leader tree. The result of open base training will look similar to what's pictured here. In closing, I'd like to address some frequently asked questions, starting with, when is the best time to prune a tree? Well, the best time for pruning is in late winter or early spring, but it can be done year-round without harm to the tree, as long as the tree is not showing signs of stress or disease. Next, should I use wound dressing? No. Research shows that it is not helpful at best and harmful at worst. How do I protect against winter sun damage? You'll want to maintain adequate soil moisture during the fall and shade the trunk with a breathable wrap, such as burlap, or you could plant a companion evergreen shrub. If you do use burlap, just be sure to remove it before summer comes. Next up, how do I prevent insects and disease? Well, luckily, Keeping the tree in good health and practicing good sanitation will prevent the majority of issues. Examples of this include properly planting your trees, providing adequate but not excessive moisture throughout the growing season with deep but infrequent waterings. You will also mulch 4 to 6 inches deep, at least out to the drip line, and you'll want to make sure you do proper pruning cuts in the late dormant season. Also, cleaning up and destroying all spent fruit is a good sanitation practice. Now, if you do these things and your tree still has issues, go ahead and contact your county extension agent or a reputable website, or maybe even a certified arborist, to assist you with correctly diagnosing your issue. Treatment without diagnosis is malpractice. And so once a correct diagnosis has been made, there are generally a host of conventional and organic alternatives to managing the issue at a tolerable level. How often should I prune my trees? Well, in the case of shade trees, we prune in the 1st, 3rd, 5th, 8th, 11th, 15th, and 20th year in the late dormant season. Or, in other words, as needed. Like we've already mentioned with fruit, we prune every year, 2 times per year for the life of the tree. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you. If you have any further questions, feel free to email me at the address below, and I'll do my best to help you out. In the meantime, stay tuned for a pruning demonstration by my good friend Preston Culver of Branch to Bud Tree Care. Thanks again.
Alright, now I'm going to do a quick pruning demonstration to show some of the principles that we discussed in our lecture. Okay, at this point in the demonstration, I want to subordinate this limb. Its size in comparison to the trunk is a little large. Its height measured from the base of the branch to the tip of the branch is greater than 1/3 of the total tree. It's too big. So in subordinating it, we are going to remove several pieces of it and still leave the branch intact, either so that it can stay there permanently, or over the course of a few years we could continue to remove pieces of it until we make a final cut and remove the entire thing. So in subordinating this, first I'm going to take this piece of it, right back to here, because this other branch here fills this space really well. Removing this piece is going to send a clear message to the rest of this big limb that it needs to slow down, settle down. It's not the leader, it's just a limb. Cut that out.
Notice that he did not use a 3-part cut because he had full control of the limb.
Okay, and then up here, if you come and look closely right here, this is an example of included bark, where this branch union is not forming like a branch union should, and will always remain a weakness as long as these two pieces are so close to the same size and such a tight, narrow crotch instead of a wide angled crotch like we like. So as part of this subordination of the bigger limb, I'm going to make a reduction cut by removing this bigger piece right here. So I start my cut here. Drop this out. And now I've subordinated this limb. I've removed enough material here to send a message for this limb to slow down. Okay, right here I'm going to demonstrate removing a crossing limb. This little guy is crossing over the top of this big one. Now, it's not always the case that you choose the little one to remove. Sometimes you would remove the bigger one. And sometimes it's not, I mean, these are both on the same parent stem where they're crossing each other. Other times you'll have a branch here and a branch here and they happen to be crossing way over here. So in this case, they're crossing over. We need to remove this piece right here. Make my cut. done. On this other side of the tree, I want to show two examples of poor structure that we're going to fix. The first is right here at this level. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4, and this little fifth one right here that are all vertically spaced very poorly. They're crowding each other in the radial spacing right here, okay? They're all at the same level. Radially, they are crowding each other. The radial spacing is poor. So I'm going to take out this one here and this one here. Up here in the tree, we have a vertical spacing problem where we have 1, 2, 3, 4 limbs stacked right on top of each other. If we were to leave either of these problems for the next 5, 10, 15 years, all of those branches in the trunk continue to size up and crowd each other more and more and more. So with these 4 limbs, I've decided I'm going to take out this one here, that's closest to you. I'm going to only take out this one half, this piece of the back branch here. I'm going to take out this piece here. And then on the top, I've decided I'm going to take out this bigger one and leave this very top one behind. So in the end, we will keep this one and we will keep this one. Alright, I finished my basic pruning on this tree. I did a crown raising where we took off some lower limbs. Overall throughout the trimming, I did thin the canopy and I cleaned the crown. But my main focus throughout the entire pruning was the structure of the tree. And you may notice as I have finished, it may look like I have left some holes in the canopy that look too open, too sparse. And that's kind of true, that's the way it is. But this tree is young enough that it has years to fill those gaps in. And as soon as this tree puts on leaves next spring, most of those gaps are not going to be that visible. And as it grows through that next growing season, it's going to fill those gaps in quickly. It's going to respond to the increased light and air penetration. It's going to fill in and balance itself out really well. Focusing on improving the structure of the tree is critical when the trees are young and you're able to shape them into what's going to become a good, strong, healthy, long-lasting tree. Okay, we finished pruning. I stacked up the brush into these 2 piles just to give you a sense of how much I took versus the maximum that we might go for. I'm estimating that these 2 piles represent about 15% of the living canopy of the tree. Maybe a little bit on the high side of 15%. 25% is our maximum. Not our target, our maximum. I stopped pruning right here. This is about 15%. There's still more work to do in this tree. I could have cut more, but I stopped thinking that this is enough for this year. The work that is left to do in this tree needs to be done next year or the year after. There's a lot that I've done today, but there's still more to do. Alright, we're going to demonstrate the 3-part cut on this limb. This cut is used to help take the weight off of the branch before you make your final cut to avoid that falling branch from tearing the bark and creating a big ugly wound on your tree. My first cut is underneath the branch, a couple inches out from where my final cut will be, and I'm going to cut into the branch about 1/4 of the way through, maybe 1/3 of the way through. I've cut under just a little bit. My second cut is outside of that, past that, on the branch, and I'm going to cut all the way through and let the weight drop off. Now that I've gotten that far, I've just got the stub left to cut. I'm going to make that final cut outside of the branch bark ridge, outside of the branch collar, And as much as possible, my cut is going to be perpendicular to the piece that I'm cutting.
I would also add that the three-part cut is for use anytime a limb is over about an inch and you cannot get complete control on it with your other hand. One thing to note too is if you are using that other hand to steady the limb, you do need to be careful not to have the saw go through the limb and into your supporting arm. That's a little tip that comes from experience. Anyways, thanks again for watching, and we'll see you later.